Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Washington Watch. Coming up,
today our nation has achieved a medical miracle. We have delivered a safe and effective vaccine in just 9 months.
That was President Donald Trump earlier this month announcing the rollout of the coronavirus vaccine. Now, parallel to the vaccine's release are lots of questions regarding the ethics of the vaccine and its effectiveness. Was fetal tissue used in the creation of the vaccine? Is it safe? Will it work? And will it be mandated? Those are just a few of the questions that I plan on addressing in this special edition of Washington Watch. So glad to have you with us. The website, TonyPerkins.com. If you're on Twitter or Parler, it is at @TPerkins. All right, on today's program, we're going to do something we don't do very often, and that is just focus on one issue, and I'm going to have one guest, and that's all we're going to talk about. We're going to dissect the coronavirus vaccine. Now, President Trump and Operation Warp Speed have been integral in the creation of a vaccine, but what else do we need to know? Joining me now to get into all of this information, how the vaccine came to be, what's in it, where it's going to take us, is Dr. David Prentice, Vice President and Research Director for the Charlotte Lozier Institute. He is also an adjunct professor of molecular genetics at the John Paul II Institute and the Catholic University of America, which I think gives him some firm ground to speak from. On top of that, Dr. Prentice is advisory board member of the Midwest Stem Cell Therapy Center, and he had a hand in actually creating that entity. We here at the Family Research Council know him quite well because he worked here for over 10 years at the Family Research Council as a senior fellow for life sciences. And prior to that, he was a professor at Indiana State University. Dr. Prentice, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thanks, Tony. Good to be with you.
Okay, we're going to jump right into this. You heard at the top of the program, the president said, we created this this vaccine rather, for the virus in 9 months. How unique is that?
This is unheard of, Tony. It's 9 months compressing this production cycle together that normally would take about 9 years. But they didn't cut any corners getting there. That's the amazing thing about this. They really pushed hard. President Trump, President Pence, leading the task force, moving this ahead at in unheard of speed and having success.
So you say they didn't cut corners. That's what's on I think the top of everyone's mind here is that, okay, we took this process from 9 years down to 9 months. How'd they do it so quickly?
Okay. So there are about 3 ways that really brought this to success. Number one, there's some new technology involved. There used to be just one way to make a vaccine against a virus. There are 5 now. And all of the Warp Speed vaccine projects used new technology that lent itself to moving ahead very rapidly. The second thing they did was they overlapped some stages of clinical trials. Usually it's a very linear process, and you wait until all the results are in, analyze them, and then you go on to the next stage. Well, they started stage 2 before they finished stage 1. They started stage 3 before they finished stage 2. Not cutting any corners in terms of making sure everything was safe and effective, but that brings us then to the third part. The government, the federal government, under President Trump's leadership, went ahead and monetized a number of these studies so that these companies could go ahead and start actually producing the final vaccine product before they ever knew if it was going to work, before they'd finished any of these trials. So they could just move ahead very quickly, so that now, at this point when we're looking at seeing now 2 vaccines approved, they've already got millions of doses ready, and they continue to pump out millions more every month.
So that last part is really the government assumed the risk of this vaccine. If it didn't work, they had put this money out for all of these doses of the vaccine, which would have been lost, but they took the risk. This is kind of what happens, I guess, when you have a businessman running the government and not a politician who's willing to take those risks, knowing what the reward is, and that is Americans being vaccinated very quickly.
Exactly. I mean, politicians tend to be risk averse, and pharmaceutical companies tend to be risk averse. And they were not going to cut their losses in this case because the federal government already indemnified them. They were able to move ahead at this very rapid pace and successfully bring it to the American people.
Okay, so Dr. Prentice, I want to go back to this new technology because this is what has a lot of people focused. Because, and you're the scientist, I'm not. But I do know how to read, and so I've been reading up on this, and I've heard from a lot of people who have some concerns. Because normally, when a vaccine is created by taking the virus, a dead portion of the virus or almost dead portion of the virus, and you make the vaccine and you inoculate someone, their body then builds up this immunity. Different technology. Explain that technology.
Right. So the old traditional way, as you've described there, is you take the virus, and let's make sure people understand, viruses have to grow inside cells. And so you have to have a dish of cells, you put the virus in there, the cells grow lots and lots of virus, you pop those cells open, get the virus out, and you kill it or weaken it at least. And what goes into my arm is whole virus. My immune system looks at that sort of whole virus image on the wanted poster, and makes antibodies and arms itself up in case an actual infectious virus ever comes in. All of these new technologies pretty much focus on just part of the virus, what would be the equivalent of the face on the wanted poster. And let's look first at the one for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, which have now been approved. They're what are called mRNA vaccines. mRNA, what's that? Well, it's a little recipe for a protein. In our cells, normally we've got that entire recipe book, the DNA genome. But if you want to make a particular protein, you don't copy the whole DNA, you copy one little section, and it becomes this mRNA molecule. Again, it's a little recipe for a particular protein. Well, what the companies did was they made the recipe for what's called the spike protein. If your listeners have seen all those images they keep showing of the coronavirus, you see all those little knobs out on the surface. That's the spike protein. It's what the virus uses to bind to our cells and infect it, but it again is going to be the most recognizable portion of that virus for our immune system to look at and attack. And so this little mRNA recipe actually was designed on computer. You don't need any cells at all to produce the mRNA vaccine. As soon as the genome structure of the virus was out there on the internet, the companies, Pfizer and Moderna, as well as a number of other companies, just sort of copied that sequence of letters down on their computer, manipulated a little bit to maybe make this recipe last a little longer, put it inside what amounts to a little oil droplet, similar to the membrane cells, and that's what the vaccine is. The recipe inside this little droplet. No cells involved at all in its design or production. The recipe gets into our cells, and our cell machinery makes that spike protein and shows it then to our immune system, and we get the antibodies made. The other technologies, the new techniques are very similar in ways. One uses a DNA piece of recipe instead of an RNA, but very similar. Another one, they actually make the spike protein in the lab. Now you do have to have various types of cells to do that. You give the recipe to those cells in the lab, they make the spike protein, and it's that protein that you inject in. But again, not the whole virus. And so it's quicker and easier to make that spike protein and just show it to the immune system. And then the final variant is you take the little recipe, but you encompass it in like a mail carrier, a virus carrier. That does have to be grown in cells, and then it's a harmless virus, so it delivers the little recipe to our cells where it makes the spike protein. But all of these newer molecular techniques are just so much quicker than having to grow a lot of cells, grow a lot of virus, inactivate or kill the virus, and so on.
So being that this is new technology, Is there a risk? Are there unknowns with this technology?
I don't think you're ever going to get away from every particular risk. I mean, there are risks with the old technology too. But even though it's just now come to the fore in terms of these mRNA technology or these others, they've been researching this for a couple of decades so far. And they've done a lot of lab experiments, even some clinical trials previously with different types of vaccines, not against the COVID-19 disease. You always wonder about what's going to happen, but that's why you do these safety clinical trials to make sure that you've got all of the problems worked out before you ever give it to the general population, before you decide on what dose might be the best dose. You look at safety first. I mean, that is the paramount criteria that you start with. And then you work through these clinical trials to find out the right dose and use, let's face it, they use between 30 and 44,000 people, which is about 10 times as many as the normal phase 3 clinical trial, because you're looking for any sort of minor reaction as a heads up to know if this is going to be safe and if it would work.
Do you think that the vaccine, the two that have been approved, do you think they are safe?
I do think they're safe. I've looked at that data, looked at the data they presented to the FDA, not just from this phase 3 trial, but the phase 1 and phase 2 trials. They look safe and they look very effective, and I would not be hesitant to take either one of them.
All right, we're talking about the safety of the issue. Some concern that we talked about this in the previous segment about how this creates a little recipe that it hands off to the cells and they start working on that recipe. But does it alter those cells? Does it change the DNA structure?
And the short answer is no. That little recipe, like all the other little mRNA recipes for the proteins normally made in our cell, it just gets in the queue. The cell reads it a few times, the little cell machinery that reads the recipe and turns it into protein that then is going to show to the immune system, and then it degrades it. So it doesn't alter our DNA. It doesn't alter our other messenger RNA. There are no lasting changes in the cell at all. You've just added a little additional recipe that our cells will be making that protein for a little while, and then it's gone.
So in effect, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're the scientist, I'm not, as I said earlier, the effect of this is no different than the traditional vaccine.
You're exactly right. And in fact, maybe a little less of an adverse effect. It's still a little too early to tell, but for the traditional vaccine, you get the whole virus. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, certainly in some of the older versions, it was just weakened. And so there was a chance that you could actually get an infection from some of these older vaccines. That's not really a problem nowadays, but with this new technology, there's nothing infectious.
Right.
You cannot get coronavirus infection from these new technologies.
So it's kind of like when you get the flu shot, many people say, I don't know if I want to get it or not. Sometimes I get sick. You can actually get a case of the flu from the flu shot, a weakened case, but you can get sick. In this vaccine, there's no virus, so you can't get it. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right.
So in some ways, the risk of that, the adverse risk, especially with something as what is proven to be so deadly as the coronavirus, that's actually checking the box of one element that is actually safer. But we have seen, some reports of people having adverse reactions to this. What's behind that?
Yeah, and that's the typical thing you get, the severe allergic reactions. I've seen reports on a very small handful of people. We don't really know for sure. There was something either in the vaccine vaccine component itself or something else may have been happening to cause that reaction. They are ready for that. As soon as they first saw that, they had the epinephrine ready, they had the Benadryl ready, and so on, and the people recovered quickly. The other part of this to think about is people focus on those severe reactions. Those are pretty rare. Mm-hmm. The CDC reports that for all these various other viral vaccines that we've already got, the rate for a severe type of allergic or anaphylactic type of reaction is about 1 to 2 per million. And you think about it, we're going to see a few of those, as we already have, if you start vaccinating millions of Americans for this type of disease. But what's the usual reaction you're going to get? Think about when you get that flu vaccine. Oh, my arm hurts. Oh, it's red. Oh, I'm sore for a while. Maybe I even get a little spike because the immune system starts activating. And you get spike in temperature, you feel fatigued for a while. That goes away. And again, they have looked at between 30 and 44,000 people for each of these vaccines to be able to say that, yeah, that's the kind of rate of reaction you get.
I mean, there's a risk with everything.
There's always a risk.
If you're alive, you're taking a risk. So
life is a risk.
It's going to happen. In a moment, I'm going to get to the issue of the fetal tissue and whether or not that was included in the testing, the research, the creation of these vaccines. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to go to the process for just a moment. Okay. Once you get vaccinated, how long does it take for this to become effective?
Okay, so and let's make sure people understand that so far these vaccines are 2 shots. You get 1 shot, and then for Pfizer, 3 weeks later, for Moderna, 4 weeks later, you get the second shot. Usually you'll start to see some immunity build within 1 week of the first shot. But to get the full effectiveness, which is something else we want to mention, you want to go through the 2-shot routine. Efficiency. Some people have said, because Pfizer is reporting 95% efficiency, Moderna a little over 94%. Some people have said it can't be. It's too good to be true. Well, the problem there is we've become so used to benchmarking everything against flu and the flu vaccines. And yeah, flu vaccine in a good year is only about 40 to 60% effective. But if you look at the CDC's numbers for these other viral vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccine is right in that ballpark. So, for example, measles is about 91 to 95% effective. The new shingles vaccine, Shingrix, 91 to 97% effective. Polio vaccine, 99%. And the list goes on and on. So it's not really surprising that we've got that efficiency.
Is a part of that this new technology? Is that contributing to that?
I don't know if it's that or if it's just a matter of flu virus is so different than most of these other viruses. But again, we've just become so used to benchmarking everything against flu that we need to kind of break that habit and look at all of these other vaccines.
Speaking of breaks, we've got to take one. We're going to come back and talk about the fetal tissue. Was it involved in this vaccine? We're going to talk about it next here with Dr. David Prentice. Don't go away. Today, focusing on one issue. Again, rarely do this, but we're focusing on the vaccine. So much attention being placed on the coronavirus vaccine. And my guest, Dr. David Prentice, he is at the Lozier Institute, Director of Research there. Dr. Prentice, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Tony.
I want to play another clip. This from Secretary Alex Azar prior to Thanksgiving, talking about, in part, the distribution.
We expect to have approximately 40 million doses by the end of this year. The product will roll off the production lines, tens and tens of millions of doses each month, and we'll vaccinate as we get them and as they're quality controlled and released.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about the fact that this comes in 2 shots. You got to get the first shot, and then depending on which vaccine, either 3 to 4 weeks later or 5 weeks later. Is it the same exact dose that you get the second time?
Yes, you get the same dose, whether it's the Pfizer or Moderna. The thing is, you need to make sure you get both doses to have the full effectiveness.
Now, will you? I'm assuming, and of course, I don't want to assume anything, that your doctor or wherever you get the vaccine would give you would want to get the same vaccine. If it's the Pfizer, you want to get the second shot would be a Pfizer as well. Is that correct?
That's right. They don't know what would happen if you got first one and then the other. You want to go back and get the exact same vaccine.
Okay. So we've established the fact that you got to get 2 shots. It starts to work, within a week or so, but then you get the second one to give you the full effect. Do we know how long the protection last?
Great question. And the short answer is no, because nobody's ever gotten this vaccine before. But we do have studies where people who had actually gotten COVID-19 back in the spring and recovered, and the studies show that the antibodies that they produced against the actual disease last at least 4 to 6 months. So I think we can probably make an analogy there and say, well, your vaccine ought to last at least that long as well.
Yeah, I mean, I had the virus back in July, and I tested 1st of September. I had strong antibodies present. And of course, the CDC is saying safely 90 days, but it could be longer. As you said, we just don't know how long this lasts. So when this begins to roll out, when can you get the vaccine? How do we know who's going to get it? How do you get in line to get it? What's going to be this process that the Secretary mentioned, the rollout that is now in place?
Right, and so the people at the front of the queue are going to be healthcare workers because they're dealing with people infected all the time, and the very high-risk folks, so the folks in nursing homes, the folks that deal with the folks and help the folks in nursing homes. After that, it looks like they're lining up first responders, again, essential workers, places like that, grocery store folks, because think about it, these are essential workers as well, and they deserve our thanks as well as the protection of the vaccine. And it'll be a few months before it kind of filters on down, but as the Secretary said in that clip, they're pumping out millions and millions of doses every month, again, thanks to the foresight of this warp speed program.
Yeah, I want to underscore that's quite remarkable, condensing down this time frame into 9 months. I certainly do not think the media has given the president and this administration the credit that is due them for delivering a vaccine so quickly.
Yeah, it is. It's a great feat. It's a unique first-time effort. But again, they didn't cut any corners in terms of safety. That's all been validated and verified by a number of inside and outside committees looking at this in terms of safety, and very effective. So new technology, condensing the whole overlap of the trials, but the government indemnifying these companies so they can just go full bore.
So David, let's kind of click through the list here. We've got a number of questions still to be answered. I want to get to the fetal tissue issue in a moment, but I want to talk about the vaccine. Can it affect pregnant women and unborn children if they're vaccinated?
And the short answer is no. And people have been a little worried about that because pregnant women were excluded from the clinical trials. But Tony, you always exclude pregnant women from clinical trials. But now that the trials have finished, or at least come to the point for the emergency approval for Pfizer and Moderna, OB-GYNs are recommending that pregnant women go ahead and get the vaccine.
Another question, can it cause infertility?
And again, the answer is no. And the problem here is there were a couple of doctors in Europe who found what they thought was similarity between that spike protein that you're going to make antibodies against and a protein that's on the placenta. And their supposition was if you made antibodies against the virus protein, it would cross-react and cause miscarriage and cause infertility. But it turns out, we did the deep dive on the actual protein structure. There's just no similarity in where the antibodies bind, so it's not a concern.
Does the vaccine contains nanotechnology. And some are thinking, well, does this allow the government then to track us? Is something inserted in there that allows those that have been vaccinated to be tracked?
And I understand people, because part of that little recipe is surrounded by what's called a lipid nanoparticle. But that's just a fancy way to say very small oil droplet. Nanotechnology involves something about the size between a protein and a cell, which is the size of that oil droplet. But there are no small nano robots or any sort of tracking devices in any of the vaccines.
Is there anything that makes this fluorescent or so that a scan would show that there has been a vaccine?
And that's because people have talked about this bioluminescence from a protein called luciferin. It's what makes fireflies light up. And you use that in some testing in the lab, but that's not a component of any vaccine whatsoever.
So I don't have to worry about my tail lighting up.
No.
All right. Now, let me get to the big issue, because this is something, you and I worked on for years when we worked on embryonic stem cell research. And, of course, we've seen this wave, a few years back of the fetal tissue with Planned Parenthood selling those baby body parts. Does this vaccine, what we've seen so far, in any form or fashion, has fetal tissue been involved?
And so the short answer is no in terms of that baby body parts and trafficking. What it might contain or might use in some, not most, but some of these vaccines are using what are called fetal cell lines. So literally decades ago, an abortion happened and some scientists took some cells from that baby, put them into the lab dish. They've been growing for decades. Now, that's a long time, long distance away, but you can still track that ethical line back to that abortion. Remember, we said the virus has to grow, or even the carrier virus or making protein uses cells. There are some of the vaccines that use those fetal cell lines, abortion-derived cell lines, in production of the actual vaccine. If you go down the list, in fact, of just the 8 warp speed candidates, the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's ongoing use to make their vaccine. The others, like Pfizer, Moderna, don't even use any cells in their production. Some of the others don't use cells at all, or they use an animal cell. There is another component, though, that people need to be aware of. Some of these companies use those fetal cells in post-production testing. So they've made the vaccine, and then they're just testing to see whether it actually works, and they're starting with cells in culture or starting with animals to see if they make antibodies. And in some, not all, but some of those tests, they did use those fetal cell lines. And for some people, that's not a concern because they're just interested in, am I going to get anything injected into my body that's touched one of those cells or even parts of those cells. But some people are concerned about a company even using that test on the side, even indirectly. What we've tried to do at Charlotte Lozier Institute is put all that information out there so everybody can see full transparency whether they did or didn't use those cells in production or in testing or anywhere else in that whole flow. And you can just go to lozierinstitute.org, and we've got a whole landing page set up, what you need to know about the COVID-19 vaccines.
Okay, so just so I'm crystal clear on this, so far we've had 2 vaccines that have been approved for distribution. We had the Pfizer and then the Moderna, right?
Right.
In those 2, if someone were to get that vaccine, would they be receiving a product that in any form or fashion had been derived from or containing fetal tissue?
No, not at all. Those two are made totally in the test tube, in the lab, without use of any cells.
All right, so the ethical issues are resolved.
Yes, I mean, they did do some testing on the vaccine afterwards.
Right.
But in terms of the production, in terms of what goes into my arm, no contact whatsoever with a fetal cell line.
So, but you did mention that Johnson & Johnson and what was the second one?
The other one is AstraZeneca.
Those
and those
two
use those fetal cells in the actual production of the vaccine. It's an ongoing, essential part of their manufacturing process. And so, the short answer is, maybe you've got some cell protein still in that vaccine, whatever thing, in the production, they are using those fetal cell lines.
So if you're going to get vaccinated, how do you determine the company that produced the vaccine that you're going to get? Is that something you inquire about with your doctor?
You have to ask. It doesn't look like, because they're just starting to roll all these out now, and probably in the coming months, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson will be approved too. So you're going to have to ask your doctor, or if you're going to the local pharmacy and they're giving the shots, you need to ask, and you just need to be totally upfront saying, look, tell me who made this vaccine.
And again, folks, the Charlotte Lozier Institute, they've been spearheading this. Dr. Prentice and their team have been running point on all of this, and they have that research, their findings at their website. We've got a link at tonyperkins.com so you can follow that over. Of course, I think Johnson & Johnson, those will probably be approved under the next administration, which would have no qualms about fetal tissue in anything, unfortunately. But before we run out of time, there are those that are saying, all right, what happens if this is mandated? Is government going to mandate that I get this vaccine, and how should I respond?
And we don't know. The indications at this point are that it will not be mandated. I don't think it should be mandated. This should be a choice that people have, and they need to know who made the vaccine and, all the other information about it, which is why we're trying to put all that out for everybody. But, government should not be telling us about that. Now, we have a certain responsibility if we choose to take or not to take the vaccine to our community, to our family, and so on.
Right.
But that needs to be weighed against a government mandate and telling you must do this. That just should not happen.
I mean, there's been so much that's been unprecedented in the way we've responded to this virus. Under no other circumstance have we shut down all of society, locked people in their homes, shut our churches, shuttered our businesses. And of course, we're reaping the effects of that. The economy is faltering, and we have people that are in isolation. Depression is up, suicide is up, drug use is up. So I'm hopeful that maybe going forward, we're not going to set more precedents by mandating this vaccine. But let's talk just for a moment, Dr. Prentice, how long will it take as this vaccine is rolling out to give us as a society a level of protection that can tamp down the pandemic?
A little difficult to tell at this point, but let's go back through, it's going to be first healthcare workers, high-risk folk, first responders, then other sorts of high-risk or essential workers, and eventually down to run-of-the-mill folks like you and me. That may take 6 months before we can finally get all the doses and get it out to everybody and get people vaccinated. The hope is that by that point then, you will have enough people just doing common sense things like washing their hands, but enough people also vaccinated that we can finally come out of this horrendous sort of quarantine that we've been in and actually come back to meeting together to worship and actually seeing family members again and so on. So it's going to take a while.
But you also have running...
But
you have running parallel to that. You have people who are actually getting the virus, overcoming it and building up the antibodies, and so they become a societal resistance to the spread as well.
Right. There's a thing they call herd immunity, where you have enough people.
I heard about that.
Who have either had the infection, like yourself, or who've had the vaccine, like we hope a lot of people are going to have, and so you develop enough protection within the community. And that's, again, how we ought to think about this in one way, is protecting our families, protecting our communities, helping one another to move forward into a better future.
Yeah. So we're looking at probably June or July before society as a whole returns to, I hesitate to say normal, but a return to some form or fashion of normality. I do think I had this conversation with Dr. Carson a couple of months ago as a member of the task force, asking him when and if we would return to normal. And he said, I don't think we'll ever return to what we were pre-pandemic. Society has altered significantly the way we do business, the way we communicate. And unfortunately, I think the fear that the media was so eager to fan the flames of has really changed the way we interact as human beings in America.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the key problem in all of this is fear.
Yeah.
And the scaremongers who have amplified the problem, not tamped it down.
Right.
But, we need to live without fear because we have a great hope. And we're looking towards remembering the arrival of that hope here very soon.
That's right. We have been given not a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. And that is our hope and promise in Christ Jesus. And so whatever may come, we can keep our heads about ourselves, take the appropriate actions and steps, but not live in fear. Dr. David Prentice, thanks so much for joining us today. Great to talk with you.
Thanks, Tony. God bless.